The moment she touched the rusted gate, Helen Carter realized something wasn't right, because this was the one place her husband had never allowed her to enter. At 71, Helen stood at the edge of a quiet patch of woods behind the old farmhouse she had lived in for over 4 decades. Just months earlier, her life had already been turned upside down. Her husband, George Carter, had passed away after a brief illness, leaving behind a silence that settled deep into every corner of the home they had built together. For 45 years, that farmhouse had been everything. The front porch where they shared morning coffee, the barn where George fixed tools late into the night, and the orchard that bloomed every spring like a quiet promise that life would go on. Helen had always believed she would grow old there, but grief had barely had time to settle when her son, Kevin Carter, began visiting more often. His words sounded reasonable at first. The house was too big, the repairs were too much. It wasn't safe for her to handle everything alone anymore. He spoke with confidence, with concern, but also with a certainty that made Helen uneasy. Eventually, he convinced her to sign the papers. Just temporary, he said. Just for protection. 3 months later, strangers were walking through her home, measuring rooms as if her life there had already ended. That was when Helen understood. She hadn't just lost her husband. She had lost everything she thought was still hers. For a while, Helen Carter tried to convince herself that her son had done the right thing. After all, that's what he kept saying. It was safer, simpler, better for her. But the truth settled in slowly, and once it did, it didn't leave. The day she returned to the farmhouse and saw strangers walking through her kitchen was the moment everything became clear. A young couple stood where she and George had shared thousands of quiet mornings, talking about renovations, measuring walls, discussing paint colors, as if her life there had already been erased. Her son, Kevin, avoided her eyes when she asked him what was happening. "It's the best thing for everyone," he said, his voice steady, almost rehearsed. "You can't take care of the place anymore. I found you a nice apartment in town. It's safer." Safer. The word echoed in her mind as she looked around the home that had held 45 years of memories. Safer didn't mean better. It meant smaller. It meant temporary. It meant leaving behind everything she had built. Within weeks, Helen packed what she could into 2 suitcases, while movers carried the rest of her life into trucks that no longer belonged to her. The morning she left, she paused at the end of the driveway, turning back one last time. The porch, the orchard, the barn. Everything was still there, but none of it was hers anymore. And for the first time, she understood something deeply painful. Trust, once broken, doesn't just hurt, it changes everything. Weeks passed slowly in the small apartment, and Helen Carter found herself surrounded not by memories, but by their absence. The quiet there felt different, heavier, lonelier. The windows overlooked a crowded parking lot instead of the orchard she had tended for decades. The walls were thin, the air unfamiliar, and every corner reminded her that this was never meant to be home. Most days, she kept herself busy sorting through the few boxes she had managed to bring. Old photographs, a worn wristwatch that had belonged to George, stacks of papers, receipts, bills, pieces of a life that now felt distant. Then, one rainy afternoon, she opened a small wooden box she didn't recognize. Inside was something she had never seen before, a folded piece of yellowed paper. Her hands slowed as she carefully unfolded it, revealing a hand-drawn map of their old property, the farmhouse, the orchard, the barn, and the forest beyond. But one section stood out. It had been circled in thick pencil, with a narrow path leading to a small symbol. A gate. Beneath it, in George's unmistakable handwriting, were 4 simple words. If I'm gone, open it. Helen stared at the message, her breath unsteady. For 45 years, there had been a part of that land she had never questioned. A section George had always kept closed off, brushing it aside with a quiet smile whenever she asked. She had trusted him. But now, for the first time, she wondered. What had he been hiding? And why had he waited until now? For her to find it. The next morning, Helen Carter couldn't ignore it any longer. With the map folded carefully in her coat pocket, she drove back to the farmhouse for the first time since she had been forced to leave. The sight of construction trucks in the driveway and strangers moving in and out of her home made her chest tighten, but she didn't stop. She kept walking past the orchard, past the memories, toward the edge of the woods. No one noticed her. The path was harder to find than she remembered, overgrown with weeds and fallen branches, as if it had been untouched for years. Leaves crunched beneath her shoes as she pushed forward, following the directions her husband had drawn decades earlier. After several minutes, the trees began to thin, and then she saw it. The rusted iron gate stood between 2 leaning posts, wrapped in thick vines that had grown wild over time. It looked older than she expected, forgotten, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. Helen stopped a few feet away, her heart beating faster. For 45 years, she had lived beside this place, and never once tried to open it. Now, her husband's words echoed in her mind. If I'm gone, open it. Her hand reached out slowly, fingers closing around the cold metal latch. It resisted at first, stiff with age, but she pushed harder. The hinges groaned loudly, breaking the silence of the forest, and inch by inch. The gate began to open. With a mixture of hesitation and quiet resolve, Helen Carter stepped through the gate. The air on the other side felt different, cooler, stiller, as if she had crossed into a place untouched by time. A narrow trail stretched ahead, winding deeper into the forest, its surface worn just enough to suggest it had been used. Often. Her breath slowed as she moved forward, gently pushing branches aside, listening to the soft crunch of leaves beneath her feet. The further she walked, the more certain she became of something she had never considered before. George had been here, many times. Small wooden stakes appeared along the path every few yards, guiding the way through the trees with quiet precision. Helen's chest tightened as a thought surfaced. Those evenings when George said he was fixing tools or checking the barn. Had he actually been walking this path instead? The idea unsettled her, but it also pulled her forward. After several minutes, the trail curved gently around a low rise, and suddenly the trees opened into a clearing bathed in soft sunlight. Helen stopped. In the center stood a small stone building, partially covered in vines and moss, its structure solid despite its age. It didn't look abandoned. It looked preserved. Her heart began to race as she approached the wooden door. There was no lock, no sign of damage. She reached out slowly and pushed it open. The hinges creaked softly as the door gave way, and as Helen stepped inside, she realized this wasn't a place her husband had hidden. It was something he had been building. At first, Helen Carter couldn't make sense of what she was seeing. Dust floated through thin beams of light from a narrow window, settling over long wooden tables covered with tools, crates, and scattered metal parts. But this wasn't a storage shed. It was too organized, too intentional. It was a workshop. Her steps slowed as she moved deeper inside, her eyes scanning every surface. Blueprints lay spread across one of the tables, held down by heavy tools as if someone had been working there not long ago. She picked one up carefully, her hands trembling as she studied the detailed drawings, gears, pipes, mechanical systems sketched with precision. At the bottom of the page, she saw a name she knew by heart: George Carter. Her breath caught. She reached for another sheet, then another. Every design carried his signature. Helen slowly turned in place, taking in the entire room. Shelves lined the walls, filled with sealed crates marked with numbers and labels. She opened one cautiously and found a compact metal engine, no larger than a toolbox. Another crate held parts for a pump system, designed to pull water from deep underground. This wasn't random work. These were inventions. Machines built to help farmers, people like them. Her hands began to shake as the realization settled in. For decades, while she believed her husband was simply fixing tools in the barn, he had been building something far greater. And she had never known. Drawn by a quiet need to understand more, Helen Carter walked toward the small wooden desk at the far end of the workshop. Several thick journals rested neatly on top, their worn covers suggesting years of careful use. She picked one up and opened it slowly. The moment she saw the handwriting, her chest tightened. It was George's. Page after page revealed dates, notes, sketches, records of experiments, improvements, and ideas that stretched back more than 2 decades. He had documented everything with the same quiet discipline she had always admired in him. But this was something she had never imagined. Her fingers moved carefully as she turned each page, absorbing the scale of what he had been doing all those years in silence. Then, near the back of the final journal, something slipped loose. A sealed envelope. Her name was written across the front. Helen hesitated, her breath unsteady before opening it. Inside was a short letter. "Helen, if you're reading this, it means I never got the chance to show you what I was building. I wanted it finished first." Her eyes blurred. These machines were meant to help farmers like us, people who struggle through the same seasons we did. I filed every patent in your name. If Kevin ever sells the house, he won't know about this place. Helen lowered the letter slowly, her hands trembling. In that moment, everything became clear. Her husband hadn't just left her a memory. He had left her a future. For a long time, Helen Carter stood in the center of that quiet workshop, the letter still trembling in her hands, as everything her husband had built began to take on meaning. At first, it felt overwhelming, too much to understand all at once. But slowly, she began returning to the hidden place again and again, spending hours reading through George's journals, studying the blueprints, and learning the purpose behind each machine he had designed. The more she read, the clearer it became. These weren't inventions created for profit alone. They were solutions, practical, thoughtful designs, meant to help small farmers survive difficult seasons. Water systems that could pull from deep wells. Engines that were simple, durable, and affordable to maintain. Everything reflected the life they had lived together, the struggles they had once faced. And for the first time since losing him, Helen felt something steady return. Not just understanding. Direction. She reached out to the company mentioned in George's documents, her voice calm but certain as she explained what she had found. Within weeks, representatives arrived to see the workshop for themselves. Their reaction was immediate. They were stunned. The designs were efficient, innovative, and ready to be produced. Exactly what farmers needed. Within a year, the first machines were being manufactured, And just like that, something George had built in silence for decades began changing lives far beyond that quiet forest. In the months that followed, Helen Carter's life changed in ways she never could have imagined on the day she stood in that small apartment, believing everything was over. The quiet workshop in the woods was no longer hidden in the same way. She restored the stone building carefully, preserving its character while turning it into a proper workspace where engineers, students, and visitors could study George's designs. What had once been a secret became a place of purpose, one that carried his work forward exactly as he had intended. As production of the machines expanded, Helen watched something remarkable happen. Farmers from across the region began using the systems George had created, simple, efficient tools that helped them manage their land with less cost and more stability. Letters arrived, messages of gratitude, stories of families who were able to keep their farms because of what he had built. And for the first time since his passing, Helen didn't feel like she had lost him. She felt like she was continuing him. Eventually, word of the discovery reached her son, Kevin. One afternoon, he returned, speaking with a tone that was suddenly softer, almost careful. He talked about family, about how proud he was, about how he could help manage things moving forward. Helen listened quietly. Then, without anger or hesitation, she led him down the path, back to the rusted gate. "This," she said gently, "is what your father spent his life building." Kevin stood there in silence, staring into the forest, finally beginning to understand what he had missed. Standing beside the open gate, Helen Carter watched her son in silence, not with anger, but with a clarity that no longer needed to be explained. For a long moment, Kevin said nothing. His eyes moved past the trees, toward the workshop hidden beyond them, as the truth slowly settled in. The house he had rushed to sell, the land he thought was too much to manage. None of it had ever been the real inheritance. It had only been the surface. Helen spoke softly, her voice steady but unmistakably firm. "Your father spent years building something here, something that mattered. But you never saw it, because you never took the time to look." Kevin lowered his gaze, the weight of her words heavier than anything she could have said in anger. For the first time he understood, not just what he had lost, but what he had overlooked. Helen didn't wait for a response. She gently closed the gate between them, the iron hinges creaking as they came to rest once again. The sound wasn't harsh. It was final. Then she turned and walked back toward the orchard, toward the life that had been waiting for her all along. Because in the end, she had learned something simple but powerful. Not everything of value is visible. Some of the most important things in life are hidden, protected for those who are willing to be patient, to trust, and to look beyond what's easy to take. And now, Helen knew exactly where she belonged. For the first time in months, Helen Carter no longer felt like she had been left behind. Standing in the quiet workshop, surrounded by the machines her husband had built piece by piece over decades, she realized something she hadn't understood before. What had once felt like loss had been something else entirely. It had been a beginning. She ran her hand gently across the wooden workbench, remembering the life she thought she had lost, the farmhouse, the orchard, the routine they had shared for so many years. But now she saw it differently. None of it had truly disappeared. It had simply changed form, waiting for her to discover what had been there all along. Her husband hadn't just left her memories. He had left her purpose. And in that purpose, she found something stronger than grief, something steady, something lasting. Helen stepped outside, the soft wind moving through the trees as sunlight filtered across the path. For the first time since everything had fallen apart, she wasn't looking back. She was moving forward. Sometimes, life will take away what feels most important. Not to leave you empty, but to lead you towards something deeper. We often focus on what's visible, the house, the money, the things we can hold. But the most valuable things are often hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the moment you're ready to see them. If you've ever felt like you lost everything, take a step back and ask yourself, what might still be there that you haven't discovered yet? Because sometimes, your greatest opportunity is hiding behind the one door you've never opened. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. What's something in your life that turned out to be more meaningful than it first appeared? And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might help you see your own life in a completely new way.